The room was small, wood-paneled, thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of too many bodies pressed into a space meant for fewer. It was late 1973, maybe early 74, one of those nights where the calendar didn't matter because the air itself felt like it belonged to no particular season, just the restless in-between. A fold-out table near the back held cassette reels and crumpled notebook pages. Someone had brought wine in a jug. The guitars leaned against the wall like they were waiting for permission. Jackson Browne sat on a stool near the window, his fingers moving slow across the strings, not playing yet, just touching them. His face was young but carried something older in the eyes, something that looked like it had been thinking too long about things that didn't have answers. Around him, people talked in low voices, the kind of talk that happens when everyone knows they're supposed to be creating but no one's sure what's supposed to come out. He didn't say much. He almost never did in rooms like this. But his silence wasn't empty. It was the kind that made you wonder what he was holding back. The air in that room carried weight, not just the smoke or the humidity of too many people breathing the same oxygen, but something heavier. Expectation, maybe. Or the opposite of expectation, the knowledge that whatever came out of these sessions would be measured against things that had already been done, already been said, by voices that had reached further and cut deeper. Jackson felt it every time he picked up the guitar. The sense that the language of what he was trying to say had already been spoken by someone else, someone who had done it better, someone who had then walked away from it entirely as if the whole thing had been a game he'd grown bored of playing. Across the country, in a different kind of room, Bob Dylan was everywhere and nowhere. His voice came through radios, through turntables, through the mouths of people who quoted him like scripture. He had become something more than a man by then, something untouchable, unreachable, a figure who seemed to live above the ordinary struggles of people who still had to write songs in cramped rooms and hope someone would listen. He had walked away from the spotlight before, disappeared into silence, and when he came back it was on his terms, in his time, with no explanation offered and none required. He owed nothing to anyone, and everyone knew it. Jackson had admired him once, maybe more than admired, maybe something closer to awe. Dylan had been the one who showed a generation that words could cut deeper than melody, that a song didn't have to comfort, it could accuse, it could question, it could burn. Jackson had learned from that, absorbed it, carried it into his own work. But somewhere along the way, the admiration had curdled into something more complicated. Not hatred, not envy. Something quieter, something that sat in the chest and made it harder to breathe when you thought about it too long. Because Dylan had also walked away. He had walked away from the people who needed him, from the causes that had held him up as a symbol, from the very idea that an artist owed anything to the world that made him. And Jackson couldn't do that. He didn't know if it was because he wasn't strong enough or because he believed something different, but he couldn't turn his back the way Dylan had. He kept showing up. He kept writing about the things that hurt, the things that broke people down in the middle of ordinary days. He wrote about loneliness that didn't announce itself, about love that decayed so slowly you didn't notice until it was gone, about the exhaustion of trying to hold yourself together when the world kept pulling you apart. And Dylan said nothing. He moved through the world like a ghost, untethered, unreachable. The distance between them wasn't geographical. It was philosophical, spiritual, maybe even moral. Dylan had claimed the right to disappear, to refuse the role of spokesman, to reject the very people who had lifted him up. He had done it publicly, defiantly, through electric guitars and sneering interviews and albums that seemed designed to alienate the audiences that loved him most. And he had survived it. More than survived. He had become legendary for it. The man who said no. The man who walked away. The man who owed you nothing and made sure you knew it. Jackson couldn't do that. Maybe it was how he was built. Maybe it was what he believed art was supposed to be. But he couldn't write a song and then pretend it didn't mean anything. He couldn't stand in front of people and tell them their need for connection was their problem, not his. He felt responsible, not in a way that made him a martyr or a saint, but in a way that kept him tethered to the ground when others were floating free. And that tether hurt, because it meant feeling everything: the weight of other people's sadness, the guilt of not being able to fix it, the exhaustion of showing up night after night, album after album, and still never quite reaching the thing you were trying to reach. The song came slowly. It wasn't the kind of thing you sat down and finished in an afternoon. It took weeks, maybe months, the verses shifting and reshaping themselves every time Jackson came back to it. He didn't tell anyone what it was about, not directly. That wasn't how he worked. He buried the meaning beneath metaphor, beneath images that could mean one thing or another depending on who was listening. A ship at sea, a man on the shore, distance, silence, the ache of waiting for someone who would never return. But if you listened close, if you knew what to listen for, you could hear it. The accusation beneath the sorrow, the question he was too careful to ask outright. Why did you leave us behind? The verses built on each other slowly, carefully. He wrote about someone who had once led the way, who had spoken truths that others couldn't articulate, who had stood at the front of something that felt like it mattered. And then he wrote about the turning away, the silence, the refusal, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with something that felt more like grief. The grief of watching someone you respected choose isolation over solidarity, choose self-preservation over collective struggle. He played it for a few people just to see if it worked. Their faces stayed neutral, polite. They nodded. They said it was good. No one asked who it was about. Maybe they didn't hear it. Maybe they didn't want to. Dylan's shadow was long, and stepping into it, even to ask a question, felt dangerous. You didn't challenge a man who had already proven he didn't need to answer. But Jackson wasn't trying to challenge. Not really. He was trying to name something that had been sitting in his chest for years, something he couldn't carry anymore without giving it shape. The song wasn't a weapon. It was a confession, an admission that he had been hurt by the silence, by the walking away, by the refusal to stay engaged with the things that still needed engagement. When the album came out, the song slipped into the track list without fanfare. No single, no radio push. Just one more track among others, carried along by the ones that would become the hits, the ones that people would sing along to in cars and at parties. And for a long time, that's all it was. Just another Jackson Browne song. Soft, sad, easy to miss. The reviews came in warm but distracted. Critics liked the album. They praised the melancholy, the craftsmanship, the way Jackson could make heartbreak sound like something elegant instead of ugly. But no one mentioned the song. No one pointed out the verses that didn't quite fit with the others, the ones that felt aimed at someone instead of sung about something. The message stayed buried. Jackson didn't talk about it. Not in interviews, not in the liner notes, not even when people asked him years later what certain songs meant. He would smile, shrug, say something vague about the creative process, about how songs come from places you don't always understand. He protected the meaning the way you protect a wound that hasn't healed yet. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Because the song wasn't just about Dylan. It was about everyone who had ever walked away from something they said mattered. It was about the people left behind, still trying, still believing, still showing up when it would have been easier to disappear. It was about the cost of staying visible when the world rewarded the ones who vanished. And Dylan never said a word. Maybe he never heard it. Maybe he did and didn't care. Maybe he understood exactly what it was and chose, as he always did, not to respond. That was his right. That was his power. The ability to exist beyond the reach of other people's expectations, other people's hurt. Jackson kept writing. He kept touring. He kept standing on stages and singing about the things that wore people down, the quiet failures, the slow erosions, the moments when you realized you'd been holding on to something that was already gone. He didn't become untouchable the way Dylan had. He stayed human, stayed visible, stayed within reach. And that meant he kept getting hurt, kept feeling the weight of it. There were nights on tour when he would play the song and watch the audience, trying to see if anyone caught it, trying to see if anyone's face would change, if anyone would lean forward with recognition, with understanding. Most nights, nothing. Just polite applause, the same as every other song. But once in a while, someone would come up to him after the show, and they wouldn't say anything directly, but they would look at him in a way that suggested they knew. They had heard it. They understood what he was trying to say. And those moments mattered more than he wanted to admit, because they meant the song had done its work, had reached across the distance and connected with someone who felt the same thing he did, who had also been left behind by someone they admired, who had also wondered why it was so easy for some people to walk away and so hard for others to do anything but stay. Years passed. The song became a footnote, if it was mentioned at all, the kind of thing musicologists might point to in retrospect, in essays about influence and rivalry, about the hidden tensions between artists who seemed to exist in the same world but never quite looked at each other. But for most listeners it remained invisible, just another beautiful, sad Jackson Browne song. Another melody to play in the background while life happened around it. Dylan kept moving. He released album after album, some celebrated, some dismissed, all of them impossible to predict. He toured relentlessly, playing his old songs in new arrangements that made them almost unrecognizable, as if he was trying to distance himself even from his own past. He gave interviews where he deflected every question, turned every moment of sincerity into a joke or a riddle. He had perfected the art of being present and absent at the same time. And Jackson watched from a distance, not obsessively, not bitterly, but with a kind of quiet attention that never fully went away. He saw Dylan change and stay the same, saw him age and somehow remain timeless, saw him continue to do exactly what he wanted without apology or explanation. And part of Jackson still admired that, still wished he could carry himself through the world with that kind of indifference to what others needed from him. But he couldn't. He was built differently. He needed the connection. He needed to believe that what he was doing mattered beyond himself, that the songs he wrote could reach someone and make them feel less alone. And that need kept him vulnerable in ways Dylan had learned to avoid. There was no moment of revelation, no interview where Dylan finally addressed it, no public acknowledgement that he'd heard the message and understood. The silence held. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the song was never meant to force a response. Maybe it was just meant to exist as a marker, a small stone placed along a path to say, I was here. I saw what you did. I felt it. Jackson grew older. His face lined, his voice deepened. He kept writing, kept performing, but the urgency softened. The anger, if it had ever been anger, dissolved into something closer to acceptance. He spoke in interviews about the difficulty of the work, the cost of visibility, the way art demanded things from you that couldn't be repaid. He spoke with respect about the artists who had come before him, including Dylan. He didn't name the song. He didn't need to. There were moments, late at night after shows, when he would sit alone in hotel rooms and think about what it all meant. The career he'd built, the songs he'd written, the choice he'd made, consciously or not, to stay engaged instead of walking away. He wondered sometimes if he'd been foolish, if Dylan had been right all along, if the only way to survive as an artist was to refuse the burden of other people's expectations, to protect yourself by keeping everyone at a distance. But then he would remember the faces in the crowds, the letters people sent him, the stories they told about what his songs had meant to them, how they'd gotten through hard times by listening to words that made them feel understood. And he would realize that he didn't regret it, that he had chosen the harder path, maybe, but not the wrong one. Dylan grew older, too. He kept moving, kept touring, kept releasing albums that confused and frustrated the people who wanted him to stay the same. He remained unreachable, unknowable, a figure who seemed to exist in his own private mythology. He gave interviews where he talked around questions, offered answers that didn't quite answer, smiled in a way that suggested he knew more than he was willing to say. He never mentioned Jackson. He never mentioned the song. And the people who had been young when the album came out grew older too. They played the record less often. They moved on to other things, other sounds, other aches. The song faded further into the background, a track most people skipped or forgot was there. But every now and then someone would find it. A kid digging through their parents' old vinyl, a fan going deep into a discography, a late-night listener letting an album play all the way through. And they would hear it, the careful phrasing, the images that felt aimed at someone just out of reach, the sadness that carried something sharper beneath it. And they would wonder. They would read the liner notes, search old interviews, scroll through forums where people argued about meanings and intentions. Most of the time, they wouldn't find anything definitive, just theories, guesses, the kind of analysis that could never be confirmed because the people involved had chosen not to confirm it. And maybe that was the lesson, if there was one, that some things are meant to stay unresolved, that not every question gets an answer, not every confrontation ends in clarity, that you can send a message into the world and never know if it landed, never know if the person you sent it to even heard it, much less cared. Jackson had written the song because he needed to, because silence wasn't an option for him the way it was for Dylan, because he believed, maybe stubbornly, maybe foolishly, that staying engaged mattered even when the cost was high, even when the person you were trying to reach had already decided not to listen. And Dylan had remained silent because he could, because he had earned the right, in his own mind and in the eyes of the world, to exist beyond the demands of others, to walk away and never explain, to let the questions pile up unanswered. Neither of them was wrong. Neither of them was right. They were just two men who had chosen different ways to live, different ways to carry the weight of what they made, and the song existed in the space between those choices, a small quiet marker of the distance that can open up even between people who seem to be walking the same path. The years kept passing. Jackson's hair went gray, then white. He still performed, still toured, though less frequently. He had become an elder statesman of sorts, respected for his consistency, his integrity, his refusal to compromise the emotional honesty of his work. People spoke of him with warmth, with appreciation, but rarely with the awe they reserved for figures like Dylan. He had remained too human for that, too accessible, too willing to let people see the effort behind the art. Dylan became a Nobel laureate. The ultimate validation, the ultimate distance. He had transcended music entirely, become something closer to literature, to history, to myth, and he accepted the honor the way he accepted everything, with a kind of bemused detachment, as if even this highest recognition was just another thing happening to someone who had long ago stopped caring what happened. Jackson watched the ceremony on television. He felt nothing bitter, nothing resentful. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the world had always loved the ones who walked away more than the ones who stayed. That there was something romantic about refusal, about distance, about the artist who owed you nothing and made sure you felt it. But he also knew, deep in the part of himself that had written the song all those years ago, that romance wasn't the same as truth, that staying mattered, that showing up mattered, that letting people reach you even when it hurt was its own kind of courage. The smoke in the small room had long since cleared. The cassette reels had been packed away, the wine jug thrown out. The guitars returned to their cases. The people who had been there that night had gone on to live other lives, write other songs, make other choices. The world had kept turning, kept changing, kept demanding things from the people who stayed visible and forgiving the ones who disappeared. And somewhere in the archives, on a shelf, in a digital file, the song waited, not for vindication, not for recognition, just to be heard if anyone cared to listen close enough, to offer its quiet testimony that staying mattered, even when no one noticed, that reaching out mattered, even when no one reached back, That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to walk away. That sometimes the hardest choice is to remain within reach, to keep your heart open, to continue believing that connection is worth the cost. That the ones who disappear are remembered, yes, but the ones who stay are needed. And maybe, in the end, being needed is more important than being mythologized. The song sits there still, waiting in the catalog, buried in the middle of an album most people have forgotten. And Dylan moves through the world, untouchable as ever, never acknowledging, never responding, never breaking the silence that has become his signature. And Jackson keeps singing, keeps showing up, keeps offering what he has always offered, himself, unguarded, unprotected, fully human. 2 men, 2 paths, one song between them that almost no one heard, and in that silence, in that distance, the entire weight of what it means to be an artist who cares too much in a world that rewards those who care too little.